Saint-Gobain is the only French company to have survived so many changes, so many political regimes, so many wars.
Colbert created 25 industrial factories. They're all dead, except for Saint-Gobain.
We stepped on a power system which rebelled.
When you want to play with the big boys, you can't be small.
He wants to take Saint-Gobain in a rather unfriendly manner, brutally.
Naively, we didn't appreciate what a certain network of influence could be like.
No doubt they lost 800 million euros. Saint-Gobain today aims to be the reference in sustainable housing.
Saint-Gobain is immortal.
Saint-Gobain has chosen to combine technology and art to highlight our innovation and our principal contributions to the modern habitat.
The story we're going to tell you is the story of a company, no doubt the oldest French company in existence today. Saint-Gobain is 350 years old, 3.5 centuries. What's incredible is that Saint-Gobain is now one of the most powerful companies in the world in the construction market. A company that financiers are beginning to dub the French Google of the home and energy transition sector. Two images could resume the whole story. The first astounds and delights tourists in Paris, the new glass floor in the Eiffel Tower. It's impressive and spectacular and a technological marvel. The same technology that can be admired in the glass and steel cloud floating over the Vuitton Foundation, a more contemporary symbol of modernity built for the king of the luxury market, Bernard Arnault from LVMH. The second image is one of a building that has been the admiration of the whole world for some 3.5 centuries. The Château de Versailles, with its hall of mirrors built by Mansart for Louis XIV. Louis XIV who made it his seat of power, Louis XIV, the Sun King who wanted to dazzle all of Europe. These images both define Saint-Gobain, but they're 350 years apart. And Saint-Gobain is the only French company to have survived so many changes, so many political regimes, so many wars. 350 years, it's incredible. It's changed name several times, but never its core activity. The company's ambition today is to compete internationally as the uncontested world leader in construction materials and habitat. It's a clearly defined ambition. To be a leading player in energy efficiency. Pierre-André de Chalandard, the current CEO, has absolutely no doubt.
Saint-Gobain aims today to be the reference in sustainable habitat, respecting the environment, saving energy, and being sustainable is completely in line with being comfortable.
Building professionals know Saint-Gobain very well. But for the general public, Saint-Gobain is rather abstract, except that Saint-Gobain is everywhere. Everywhere, but without necessarily saying so. Windows and mirrors, of course, in buildings and cars, that's Saint-Gobain. But also all manner of building materials, starting with plasterboard, glass, wool and insulation products that we find in distribution outlets like La Paire and Point P. Everyone knows them. There's a lot of research and innovation in this industry, and a lot of factories with a high added value. Whole classes of graduates as well as considerable long-term capital investments, as the long-term is key at Saint-Gobain. The numbers that are crunched by financial analysts are therefore astoundingly stable over a long period. Saint-Gobain today is the world leader in high-performance and insulation materials. With a turnover of 41 billion euros, Saint-Gobain is established in 66 countries and has a workforce of 180,000. That's impressive. That's quite something. The market is housing, habitat, a primary necessity since the dawn of time. That's what makes Saint-Gobain immortal, as the elders like to say. Because former directors may leave their posts at retirement age, but they don't leave the company. The company keeps them under its wing. Not with a specific responsibility, but because they watch over the continued respect for the group's cultural principles. Roger Fauroux was president of Saint-Gobain between 1980 and 1986. He's still there. Jean-Louis Beffa took over at the helm until 2010. He's still there. Presidents pass on the torch, and the group goes on.
Saint-Gobain is immortal. I'm simplifying somewhat if you like, but there's a solid basis of skills and crafts, an industrial tradition, and an industrial quality that's expressed in the quality of our products, the quality of our research, and the quality of our personnel, which in relation to short-term market fluctuations provides a certain security and invulnerability.
It's true that we're people who believe, first of all, in the long term, who believe in technology. We don't believe in speculative and short-term financial liberalism. We believe in social dialogue. Basically, we're a group that's run rather like a major German group.
And so there's a secret to Saint-Gobain's longevity. And it's this secret that we're going to try to reveal. 350 years of French history. 3.5 centuries. Not so much a simple story as an epic. Obviously, Saint-Gobain has changed a great deal. It's changed its structure, its manufacturing methods, its funding, its relations with the state, its sometimes dangerous and improper liaisons. But what's extraordinary is that the company has never changed its core trade. It may have been tempted to follow fashion, as we'll see, like getting into IT, for example, but this never really came off. Saint-Gobain has experienced failure. But Saint-Gobain has always bounced back, relying on its basic craft, construction, housing, habitat. That's where its DNA is, nowhere else. It's here that Saint-Gobain would be born, right here in the Salon of Louis XIV in the Château de Versailles. Legend has it that one day Louis XIV thanked his minister Colbert for having created the Royal Mirror Glass Factory, and particularly for having been able to produce these mirrors which reflect the setting sun. Mirrors that for a long time only the Venetians had been able to produce. Colbert was delighted, and courtiers gathered round to listen to the king. But sire, said Colbert, why this gallery? To connect the king's chambers with those of the queen, so that the whole court may know when I visit her in the evenings. But why all the mirrors, Majesty? It's quite simple, Colbert. The mirrors are there so that the court may admire itself from head to toe. They have nothing to do, and as long as they can look at themselves, they will not get involved in politics. In time, Colbert, you will see that ministers who succeed you will invent television, which will serve the same purpose. Politicians will be able to watch themselves. Okay, I'm not sure that the king actually said that, but he could have. Maurice Hamon is an historian. He regards the mirrors as being symbols of luxury at the time, the signs of true wealth and real power.
From the middle of the 17th century, in wealthy families, and notably in the mansions of the aristocracy and the gentry, the finances in Paris, it was customary to have a private reception room, a ballroom, to present débutantes to society, for example. And it was usual to place mirrors next to each other. But it was very expensive. The mirrors had to be bought in Venice, so it was very much a luxury product.
The Venetians' monopoly in the manufacturing of mirrors had become unbearable. The fortune of Saint-Gobain, known at the time as La Manufacture Royale des Glaces de Miroirs, would come from its ability to produce the celebrated mirrors.
Colbert conceived of a grand plan, particularly as Louis XIV wanted to fight wars and therefore needed money. Colbert persuaded the king not to make savings, but to profit from new industries.
In order to do this, Colbert had to try to procure the manufacturing secrets that had made Venice's fortune on the island of Murano, where the mirrors were produced. It may not have been the heist of the century, but it was one of the first cases of industrial espionage perpetrated by the French state successfully. The king clearly covered the operation, and it was not easy.
It's a spy story, and absolutely fascinating. The adventure began in 1663-64. Colbert started to send spies on observation missions. The spies came back, rather pessimistic, saying, "You know, Murano is an island, it's closed up, and moreover, Venetian law is very strict." There was a whole range of punishments which could be very severe because it could involve retaliation against families, and there were even death threats made against workers who fled abroad. Murano was protecting its secrets.
And so rather than steal the process, which was complicated, it was decided to bribe workers from Murano and attract them to France.
Obviously, the Italians and Murano knew what was going on. And so, in reality, those who came, in 3 or 4 waves, were not the best examples. I think the people of Murano would have said, "This is an excellent opportunity to get rid of some worthless people, so we'll send them to France."
Colbert's genius was to invent what would become Colbertisme. Colbertism had nothing to do with state capitalism. Saint-Gobain would be an experiment. Colbert created a royal manufacture, but he ensured that it belonged neither to the king nor to the state. Ownership was offered to private stakeholders, friends of the regime, preferably.
In the same year, Colbert created 25 industrial factories, and they've all disappeared except for Saint-Gobain. Because the problem afterwards was to find managers and capitalists capable of successfully running this type of business.
Colbert found what were not yet called investors, but they were pretty similar. They were capitalists. He invented them because they weren't many at the time. They were above all pawnbrokers. Colbert also set up a management system. There were many courtiers, but courtiers don't work, and there weren't many experts. And so the Manufacture Royale des Glaces de Miroir, as it was called, was a private company, created in October 1665, and run according to principles developed by Colbert. It would become one of the kingdom's first industries. Any link with the state, because there was a link, passed through channels unrelated to funding. Period documents attest to this. The king granted a certain Noyer, the company's first president, what are called letters patent.
The factory was granted certain privileges via these letters patent, which exempted it from various taxes and tolls. There were 5,200 tolls in the kingdom at the time, we mustn't forget. So state protection intervened there, and the regime allowed the business to develop under relatively favorable conditions.
The first workshop was established in Paris in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Later on, when a revolutionary process was discovered for manufacturing the mirrors by pouring them onto a metal table rather than blowing them, the royal factory moved to a small village in Picardy, precisely to Saint-Gobain. And with these glass mirrors, they had a gold mine. Mirrors became hugely fashionable in the 18th century. Prices fell, and everybody wanted one. Even the people were buying mirrors. Colbert's organization survived him and proved to be highly effective. It was sufficiently modern that in the 1750s it was run by a woman, which is quite unbelievable, Madame Geoffrin. A young courtesan, a commoner from Paris who married a company manager when she was 16, and he eventually acquired enough capital to run the company.
She lived with her aged husband for many years, hating him as he lived to a ripe old age. But he did see fit to leave her 13% of Saint-Gobain's capital when he died in 1749.
Madame Geoffrin therefore inherited an industrial empire and became the first female company boss in France's history. It's quite incredible, but she ran the company, and above all, she became one of the most influential women of the century. The advantage she had over other women in Paris who tried to hold salons was that she was rich, very rich. And money at the time opened the doors to power more easily than noble titles. And so, Saint-Gobain remained at the heart of power struggles.
Her salon would become famous throughout Europe and attract all the leading writers and artists and so on. It's quite amusing that all these philosophical types who are hostile to industry ideologically would come and dine at the queen of that very industry. It's quite extraordinary.
In 1789, the Revolution abolished the monarchy and suppressed all privileges, including those enjoyed by royal companies. Robespierre and Danton were ruthless, but the Royale Manufacture would not be destroyed. Jobs had to be preserved, and so only the name would change. It became the Manufacture de Saint-Gobain. The changing times, however, were brutal, and the company suffered. The luxury market had lost its luster. The rich and the nobility had emigrated. European competition was tough. The Italians, the Germans, and the British were hyperactive on the market. And the company no longer had state protection. Sales collapsed. In order to get by, and as a new, effervescent century dawned, Saint-Gobain underwent its first major metamorphosis. As France was converting to economic development, Saint-Gobain would be one of the most active developers. Making mirrors and glass requires large quantities of lime and sand, and so various chemical products were commercialized. Little by little, the company's DNA was being drawn up.
We're talking about a veritable industrial revolution phenomenon, a revolution in knowledge, in the recruitment of technicians. Strategies were developed and production tools revamped. It's a typical example.
And then, as France emerged from the Second Empire, an architectural wizard appeared who would boost the whole sector. Gustave Eiffel combined his workshop's metal structures with the glass produced in Saint-Gobain's factories. The result shaped the face of modern Paris as we still know it. The Grand Palais, the Gare d'Orsay, the Austerlitz and Lyon stations, Saint-Lazare, Saint-Gobain became indispensable.
The 19th century was a golden age for glass, and notably the Second Empire, with a boom in construction and building projects. The Second Empire was the golden age for the glass industry.
The company entered the 20th century in fine shape. Saint-Gobain bought up many of its competitors and was involved in all types of glass products: panes for windows, automobile windows, bottles, and even optical glass. Colbert's old factory established branches everywhere in Europe between 1850 and 1890. In Germany, Italy, Belgium, Holland, and even in Spain in 1905. In 1902, Saint-Gobain was listed on the Paris Stock Exchange. It was a major event, a commercial springboard for the managers rather than a consecration. Investors were euphoric. But the euphoria would not last long. In 1914, the war hit hard. Saint-Gobain's factories in France were damaged from the outset, but the company was rich, with considerable assets.
Fortunately, the company was so prosperous that it had extensive financial reserves. But conditions during the 1418 war were not always comfortable, of course.
The euphoria returned quickly, very quickly, after the war, during the 1920s. The decade would see Saint-Gobain's development in the automobile industry. Renault, Peugeot, Citroën, Panhard, the Dion-Bouton and Bugatti all vied for supplies. The core trade, however, was still construction. And Saint-Gobain was innovating. The most important innovation was glass wool. Ecology was a thing of the future, but the need for effective insulation was already an obsession for many builders. The notion of comfort was introduced into the habitat. It was an astounding success.
A little glass wool from Saint-Gobain is efficient, economical, and easy to install. Saint-Gobain glass wool means warmth in winter and cool comfort in summer.
Business picked up again, yes, but the risk of war was ever present. Everyone knew it, everyone felt it in every European capital. Europe had not recovered from the crisis and fell into flag-waving and fascism. Once more, the euphoria was short-lived. The German occupation of France in June 1940 brought everything to a brutal halt. Saint-Gobain's directors left Paris and sought refuge in the Château de Menard in the Loire-et-Cher department near Blois, a magnificent domain built for Colbert's father-in-law. But for Saint-Gobain, like for most companies, the occupation years would be painful. Painful, but filled with courage too. As, unlike many other French industries at the time, Saint-Gobain managed not to compromise itself. For example, it responded to German requisition commands, but very cleverly.
Saint-Gobain used a tactic that was typical of its long-term philosophy and culture. Saint-Gobain managed to send only 1/3 of the manpower that the occupying forces demanded. And moreover, they used various administrative tricks whereby workers were transferred to Saint-Gobain's factories in Germany. So compared to what we would call forced labor, used massively by the chemical industry and others, Saint-Gobain avoided dirtying its hands. And the Saint-Gobain employees were very grateful after the war.
At the end of the war, however, the company was considerably less dynamic than before. It had fallen behind in technological innovation. The company leaders were weary. Investors were from a bygone age. Saving their necks was more of a priority than investing any further. Arnaud de Vauguet was a family man, more attached to respecting tradition than innovating. He garnered more honors than he did patents. His France was eternally conservative. To get a glimpse of how that paternalistic capitalism functioned, let's look at a scene from The Possessors, directed by Denis de la Patelière in 1958. It's the story of an industry tycoon and his sons, with Jean Gabin as the patriarch. The script was written by Michel Audiard.
Nous sommes pourtant de la même famille. Nous ne donnons pas le même sens à ce mot.
Ah, voilà. Nous avons de l'argent tous les deux. Toi, tu représentes le patronat, moi, le capitalisme. Nous votons à droite. Toi, c'est pour préserver la famille. Moi, c'est pour écraser l'ouvrier. 10 couples chez toi, c'est une réception. Chez moi, c'est une partouze. Et le lendemain, si nous avons des boutons, toi, c'est le homard, moi, c'est la vérole.
This is cinema, of course, but it was real life that Saint-Gobain had to face up to. At stake was the very future of the industry. Everyone was waiting for a major innovation. Saint-Gobain was being watched and spied on from every side. But Saint-Gobain had nothing up its sleeve. Saint-Gobain was surviving thanks to the Trente Glorieuses, the post-war economic boom where needs dictated demand. Saint-Gobain benefited from the reconstruction markets, but was making no real progress.
A new era dawns with the Fifth Republic. General de Gaulle, elected president, enters the Élysée Palace. Welcomed by René Coty and the state's highest authorities, he will be presented with the insignia representing his office and national responsibilities.
After 1958, when General de Gaulle returned to power to bury the Fourth Republic and restore a semblance of order, Georges Pompidou launched a vast construction campaign in Paris, the Seine riverfront, La Défense. Paris needed to be modernized with insulating glass and mirrors. But Saint-Gobain was absent. The new technologies in glass production, which would change everything from quantities to prices, were developed by Saint-Gobain's great rival, Pilkington. And it was Pilkington that won the deals. To try and catch up, Saint-Gobain joined forces with the American company CertainTeed. Saint-Gobain finally managed to buy the company, but only much later in 1976. And meanwhile, Saint-Gobain itself was extremely fragile. In 1968, Paris exploded, but Saint-Gobain's leaders were oblivious to student revolts. However, one man in Lyon realized that springtime had come. He was getting bored with his family business, a glass-making company called BSN, and his name was Antoine Riboud.
Competition in the glass sector doesn't begin and end with BSN and Saint-Gobain. In fact, within Europe, and Europe may one day include England and the common market, there's Pilkington. And the Belgians are very powerful, and the Americans established in Italy. And there's BSN.
Antoine Riboud decided he wanted to buy Saint-Gobain, a folly. Why not Chartres Cathedral too? Saint-Gobain was perhaps an endangered masterpiece, but it was also an historic monument, a sanctuary of French Catholic capitalism.
An unprecedented media campaign, whole pages devoted to the Saint-Gobain, Boussois, Souchon, Neufcelle affair.
an event which will go down in the stock market exchange history books, played out on the public stage.
With very little money, the upstart provincial Protestant launched the first hostile takeover bid recorded at the Paris Stock Exchange. But takeovers can be barbaric.
In a spectacular move in late 1968, the small-scale Boussois launched a takeover bid for the giant Saint-Gobain.
After an epic battle bordering on a war of religion, Antoine Riboud failed, of course. But for him, it was a godsend. Without his failure, Riboud would never have built Danone.
I launched a takeover bid for Saint-Gobain in December 1968 and failed miserably. It was the best thing that ever happened to me.
For Saint-Gobain, it was one crisis too many. The shareholders brought in Marcel Bleustein-Blanchet, the president of the advertising company Publicis, who waged one of his most determined campaigns. He saved them from the takeover, but the victory ruined them. The Saint-Gobain empire was on the verge of collapsing. A financial solution had to be found to avoid a catastrophe.
A year ago, we were expecting to see Boussois and Monsieur Riboud, but today it's Pont-à-Mousson and his president, Roger Martin, who prevail.
Pont-à-Mousson was a company specializing in cast iron pipes. Pipes used to transport water, and water has always been very much in demand. Pont-à-Mousson had other qualities too. The shareholders were very diverse. The real power was wielded by management, and the management was essentially from the Corps des Mines, a centuries-old engineers corporation, essentially a fast-track club for CEOs and ministers. The old-school tie à la française, perfect for Saint-Gobain.
This operation isn't comparable to the other takeovers that Saint-Gobain has been involved in the past. It's a merger, meaning that two major companies are pooling their resources, their activities, and their production facilities.
What name will the companies adopt?
I think we'll give them the name Saint-Gobain Pont-à-Mousson.
In 1970, the press announced the period's biggest merger between Saint-Gobain and Pont-à-Mousson. Business in France was on the move at last. President Pompidou gave his blessing to a marriage of reason. And yet it was not the big Saint-Gobain from Paris taking over the provincial Pont-à-Mousson, but the reverse. Roger Fourou recalls the event.
Pont-à-Mousson was about one-third the size of Saint-Gobain, at best, one-third to a quarter. As it happened, Pont-à-Mousson had legal structures and men and staff that were much more solid, and financial reserves that were much more solid than their new partners. This meant that whereas logically, if you like, financially and legally, the giant Saint-Gobain swallowed up the little youngster from Lorraine. In actual fact, the men from Pont-à-Mousson quite rapidly took control.
The Pont-à-Mousson management would therefore take command and rebuild a group whose strategy became very simple. Focus everything on building materials from production to distribution, and in a maximum of countries. It disengaged from chemicals, oil, steel, paper, and wood, nuclear power, from all manner of diversifications, and so it lost weight, but built up muscle instead. The strategy appears today to be quite logical. At the time, conglomerates were the trend, along with diversification, the model being General Electric. Saint-Gobain was going against the grain.
On one hand, cast iron. On the other, glass. What is the connection? A market. The construction market, housing and offices, etc. For Monsieur Martin, an industry isn't just a product that you manufacture, but above all, a market whose every need you have to meet.
So ultimately, what are you going to do with this strength?
This strength will be used to allow us to compete on the international markets, where we're already present. When you want to play with the big boys, you can't be small.
Roger Martin, the charismatic boss of Pont-à-Mousson, did not come alone. In order to build and develop the new group, he surrounded himself with a broad range of executives and directors from the finest business schools and polytechnics in France. He began to diversify the company's recruitment policy. Roger Martin's smart employment strategy would soon become central to the company's genetic makeup. Alain Minck, who was hired as financial director by Roger Fourou, rapidly understood that the Saint-Gobain Pont-à-Mousson philosophy was to create a breeding ground for executives and experts.
The emperor has a pull. a breeding ground that he creates, and from within the pool, only one is chosen. When you have 5 guys who can all aspire to being number 1, and you choose one, there's a big advantage. You can choose one from among 5 who are all pretty good. And when you see that the 4 others who haven't been chosen all become bosses in other companies almost immediately, you can say it's a good process. From this point of view, Saint-Gobain, in my opinion, is the French company that's most successfully handled the succession problems.
The selection process is a bit of a mystery. It's rather like the Vatican. You just have to wait for the white smoke to know who's going to be the new pope. Those excluded from the contest don't end up at the job center, however. They may be upset sometimes, but they get over it fairly quickly. Saint-Gobain is a good school for the captains of French industry. Jean-Louis Beffa believes they all take something of Saint-Gobain's culture with them wherever they go. He describes them as if they were missionaries out to evangelize French industry.
The boss of Valeo, Aschenbroich, the boss of Vallourec, Creuset, people who I trained myself, personally. The boss of Dimetal, too. The boss of Michelin, Sénart. They're all former Saint-Gobain men, and they were all under my personal authority. And these men, I see them. I see in their way of running things that they share values for their new groups that are similar to those of Saint-Gobain.
Within the group, rigor and performance are values that are omnipresent. But the golden rule is to comply with strategy and to apply it without question. Alain Minc, who came in to handle financial affairs, respected this philosophy, but soon grew impatient. He was interested in diversifying investment. He was interested in everything, but computers were a passion. He set his heart on Honeywell Bull, who needed a forceful shareholder.
Saint-Gobain was in fairly easy-going businesses, and the idea was to get it involved in a sector with substantial growth potential. It's simply the way conglomerates operate. You jump from one branch to another, and at a certain point, you have to jump onto a branch which will provide the growth that your more traditional sectors don't give you.
Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French president, regarded the project favorably. France was absent from the global IT market, and the new technology had considerable potential. He knew it. He could feel it. General de Gaulle and Georges Pompidou had ushered in the Airbus, the TGV, and nuclear power. So why couldn't Giscard create the big computer industry Europe was lacking? Having said that, he had no money. The oil crisis had emptied the state coffers. But Alain Minc had another solution.
It initially came about with semiconductors. With the backing of the government, of the public authorities, and of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and then through the state's proposal to become the reference shareholder of CII Honeywell Bull. The third thing, that we invented ourselves, in fact, and in which I played a more significant role than my colleagues, perhaps, was becoming the controlling shareholder in Olivetti, which had just been rehabilitated by Carlo De Benedetti. That was a private idea, applied to the private sector, and the rest was in line with the French system, a mix of public and private. The whole thing was like a jigsaw puzzle. And as soon as nationalization happened, the pieces were taken away from us, and our toy was taken away by our stakeholder.
This was 1980. The following year, Giscard lost the presidential elections, and the Socialist Communist Union of the Left, led by François Mitterrand, was voted in. In May 1981, one of the new president's first decisions was to privatize Saint-Gobain. The announcement had the effect of a bombshell.
It was a bombshell because François Mitterrand had the totally bizarre idea of nationalizing anything he could lay his hands on. All the banks were nationalized, all of them, without exception. And any industrial company with a turnover above a certain figure was nationalized as well. It was purely ideological. It was irrational. But we found ourselves nationalized. Mr. President, it is a great honor for Saint-Gobain to welcome you here to our headquarters, Les Miroirs. I am only too aware that I stand before you, not so much a host, but a witness to the exemplary action for employment achieved with our help by the 105 company heads who receive you here today.
In order to sweeten the pill for the existing management, the incumbent president was left in place. Brought in by Roger Martin, President Roger Fourou fortunately happened to be a friend of Michel Rocard, the Prime Minister, except that he had a hard time accepting the strategy imposed by the Élysée Palace. The almost theological debate surrounding diversification into new technologies, Alain Mac's dream, was halted very rapidly, for example. The move into computers was abandoned. Alain Mac complied, but reluctantly.
If Saint-Gobain had remained private, we would have pursued that diversification, and we would have built a substantial group. But it's true that in order to finance that development, we would have had to sell off certain traditional sectors.
Through the nationalization of Saint-Gobain, the left procured a very healthy company. But for Roger Fourou, the nationalization made no economic sense and seemed pointless. As a good president, however, he towed the party line. Mitterrand wanted Saint-Gobain, so he got it. But certain meetings with the government turned out to be rather odd.
I remember one meeting that Pierre Mauroy had organized at Matignon. New company presidents were summoned. Afterwards, people were asking questions, and I raised my hand and asked if we couldn't have foreigners on our boards, as almost half our turnover came from abroad. That would seem normal for me. Mauroy was gripped by terror at the idea, because for him it was such a ridiculous question, and in his opinion so stupid, that he was almost speechless. He said, "Listen, no, I mean really." Then I asked him a second question. Can we still be members of the CNPF, the bosses' union? That was a second blasphemy. And he said, "Listen, no, I think that would probably be awkward." There were two different cultures. It was really a case of conflicting cultures.
The conflict was fairly brutal. No one understood one another. No one even listened. After nationalization, the directors of Saint-Gobain, led by Fourou and Mac, planned to organize taking over the Général des Eaux company.
In an agreement between Saint-Gobain and the Général des Eaux, the former will sell its public works subsidiary to the latter. The operation will involve a capital increase. The Général des Eaux could therefore become the fourth largest public works company, alongside Bouygues, Dumez, and SPIE Batignolles.
But it didn't work out. The Élysée Palace vetoed it, without saying why, a royal prerogative, as it were. Today, more than 30 years later, Alain Mac is still enraged by the failure. No doubt, for the first time, he reveals the real explanation.
Why did it fail? Quite simply because we'd been nationalized, and we were bold enough to take more than 30% of the Général des Eaux while informing the government, vaguely. And we didn't know what we were stepping into. We stepped on a power system which rebelled. And all the ministers with links to the Général des Eaux went to see François Mitterrand. And obviously, in our naivete, and SG is a very pure company, naively, we didn't appreciate what a certain network of influence could be like. So François Mitterrand, under pressure from all the Freemasons who surrounded the left at that time, finally forbade it.
Alain Mac, who had already been unhappy about the Bull affair, was even more appalled at the Général des Eaux fiasco. He left Saint-Gobain in 1986. That same year, the cohabitation government, Prime Minister Édouard Balladur, decided to privatize Saint-Gobain.
The unions have seen that the nationalization of the group has not brought about any change, so they are clearly expecting nothing better from privatization. Since 1983, Saint-Gobain has reduced its workforce by 5% a year, and the unions believe this policy will continue. A policy based on cost effectiveness and foreign investment, which will now be intensified to the detriment of employment. In fact, 4 years later, it's quite simply back to square one.
The public ownership period would therefore be short-lived. It lasted just 4 years, 4 useless years, it's been said, but in Saint-Gobain's 3-century history, it's a minor detail. Privatization came about with no discussion and no drama. The left didn't bat an eyelid. Investors were well treated, and for the first time, employees bought into the company massively, to the extent of becoming the primary shareholders.
Si je connais Saint-Gobain, on y travaille. Et on peut vous dire, c'est du solide, Saint-Gobain. Vous en achèteriez des actions Saint-Gobain? Des actions Saint-Gobain, bien sûr, je suis partant.
Saint-Gobain, j'achète.
We've already seen numerous subscribers in the banks this morning, and also at our factories. Employees and workers have come to fill in their subscription forms.
Jean-Louis Beffa was in charge of the return to the private sector. Beffa was a Pont-à-Mousson thoroughbred, a disciple of Roger Martin. He had to face a number of challenges as huge changes were envisaged.
I immediately established 3 principles. The first was to stay in sectors where we were already a world leader. The second was not just to be a group with a single business, as the financial markets demand sometimes, what we call a pure play. And thirdly, to be resolutely international. When I arrived, we had factories in 18 countries, and when I left, we were in 64. Obviously, we were lucky with the opening up of market economies in the former communist countries.
Jean-Louis Beffa would multiply Saint-Gobain's acquisitions in the East, in Russia, in China, throughout Asia. He also bought Norton, an American abrasives, ceramics and plastics company. Saint-Gobain became the world leader in construction materials and insulation products. Then, in 1996, the group entered the retail market, buying up the French Polyette group with the Point-Pay and La Paire outlets. This brought Saint-Gobain closer to consumers and strengthened links with various companies in the construction and housing sectors.
The companies we bought had values that were pretty similar to our own, and notably the biggest of them, Polyette, which means Point-Pay. The people from Point-Pay reasoned in the same way as people from Saint-Gobain. So among the people we bought, if you like, there was never really any difficulty in assimilating from a psychological point of view.
Saint-Gobain would then take a decisive step forward by buying the leading producer of plasterboard, the British company BPB. Along with the Isover insulation branch, allying plasterboard and insulation, Saint-Gobain now became the world leader in interior building materials for the construction and renovation of residential and commercial buildings. Saint-Gobain was well placed to enter some new, gigantic markets. Beffa established the group's HQ in Les Miroirs, a tower block in La Défense business district. From here, he could see all of Paris, but he couldn't see inside a mansion in the Marais Quarter, where an unknown financial wizard, as he's been called, was preparing to declare war against him. The wizard in question was Jean-Bernard Lafontat. No one knew who he was, but he'd been to the right schools too, and worked in socialist ministerial cabinets, then in banking at Lazare, the BNP, with Michel Pébreau. He was armed to the teeth when he was recruited to run Wendel. Wendel was a family company with a long history in the steel business. Its president was Ernest Antoine Sellière, a baron who was determined to do a makeover of a business that provided handsomely for some 250 members of a rather turbulent family. To reboost Wendel, Jean-Bernard Lafontaine had the same brilliant idea, he thought, as Antoine Riboud before him, to take over Saint-Gobain in a not-so-friendly manner brutally. Virginie Rousseau, an analyst at Odo & Company, is familiar with the affair's darker dealings.
What happened with Wendel is that in 2007, Wendel decided to increase its stake in Saint-Gobain and took almost 20% of the capital in a way that was hostile, without consulting the incumbent management. Discussions were pretty stormy, and Wendel was quite vindictive in the strategy they wanted Saint-Gobain to implement.
Without telling us, and concealing his intentions, Jean-Bernard Lafonta took 20% of Saint-Gobain, taking 4% each time, covertly, without informing us. And as he was a man who had no real industrial vision, but only a purely financial vision, I thought his intention was to dismantle Saint-Gobain.
At Saint-Gobain's HQ, it was a tough blow, but they resisted, and rightly so. Lafonta had foreseen everything except the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. He struck out. Share prices fell by 50%, then 75%. In the Wendel family, panic and revolt set in. The French stock market regulator AMF intervened. Ernest Antoine Sellier had a hard time explaining himself, and he lost a lot of money.
The people from Wendel who had taken huge risks in Operation Saint-Gobain, amassing gigantic debts, couldn't follow up. They still had rights, but they sold them very badly, and they no doubt lost 800 million euros.
Even today, Jean-Louis Beffa can barely disguise his pleasure. Wendel lost more than 800 million euros. Jean-Bernard Lafonta left Wendel in March 2009. He was replaced by Frédéric Lemoine, whose mission was to redress the company's finances and, above all, make peace with Saint-Gobain. The situation today is more or less stable.
Relations between Saint-Gobain and Wendel today have become more peaceable. I think Wendel provides real support for Saint-Gobain today, despite a rather stormy start to the story.
Wendel became Saint-Gobain's principal shareholder with 12% of the capital. Wendel obtained 3 seats on the board, and Pierre-André de Chalandard, who succeeded Jean-Louis Beffa, as in-house tradition would have it, considers that Wendel is now an ally. For Pierre-André de Chalandard, Wendel is no longer an issue. The issue for him is enabling Saint-Gobain to maintain its position as world champion in habitat materials and insulation. The market is controlled by a few very large companies. It's not easy to progress. However, on his arrival, Pierre-André de Chalandard committed the company to facing the challenges of the 21st century, digital technology in company operations, improving competitiveness and productivity, with comfortable and sustainable housing as a key objective. For him, the company has what it takes to succeed in energy efficiency. Moreover, the staff like the idea, as does the market, the press, and the world of politics.
One major venture for Saint-Gobain in recent years has been development in the energy efficiency sector. Energy efficiency represents around 30% of Saint-Gobain's business today, and this is going to increase over the coming years.
In the habitat, as populations in different parts of the world attain greater purchasing power, the notion of comfort becomes extremely important. Comfort means thermal comfort, but also acoustic comfort. Noise is a problem that we increasingly try to cut ourselves off from. Obviously, there is visual comfort too, and our original material, glass, without going all the way back to Colbert, is a material that architects in general greatly appreciate. Comfort in terms of the quality of the air is something we work on a great deal too. And then there are new types of comfort, such as the emerging and growing demand among seniors for modularity, and the idea that we can change the composition of a house or an apartment to adapt to changing lifestyles as people get older.
To reinforce this strategy, Saint-Gobain recently sought to buy the Swiss company Sika, another heavyweight on the world building materials market, specializing in bonding, sealing, and soundproofing products. Products with significant added value. Specialized markets, markets with high profit margins.
The acquisition of Sika corresponds to the development strategy in products with a high added value, substantial growth potential, and oriented to the emerging markets.
The Swiss management, however, initially resisted. Saint-Gobain became bogged down in legal wrangles in an attempt to take control of the company's destiny. But finally the deal will go through. Saint-Gobain has experience of such cases. The company's priority now is to be the world leader in sustainable housing at reasonable cost for the greatest number, and to ensure the company's development for at least another century.
Saint-Gobain's immortality will depend on the ability of future management to continue to adapt to the ever-changing environment, because obviously growth will probably be much weaker in Europe, and particularly in France. So the real challenge for Saint-Gobain is to continue to diversify geographically and to pursue its development across the Atlantic and in fast-growing countries. Certain sectors will stand out performance-wise. I firmly believe in Saint-Gobain's venture into energy efficiency. I think it can be an important vector for growth. They'll have to find other such vectors too and continue to adapt.
What's extraordinary is that at the ripe old age of 350, the company still has a glowing future. Everything changes constantly, but everything stays the same. Colbert must not be too displeased with his creation. Except that Saint-Gobain is less and less French, less and less Colbertiste. Saint-Gobain is a global company through its turnover, shareholders and facilities. Pierre-André de Chalandard spends more time in a plane than in his office, but he's wary of preconceived ideas.
It's a multi-regional company, a multinational company, but the headquarters is in France. It has a French heart. There's a significant contribution from R&D too, which is in France. And there's a substantial French presence in the top management. And even if our vocation is to diversify, this is an important element. So yes, I do think that there's an important French element to Saint-Gobain.
So that's the astonishing story and history of a company that set out from Versailles, 3.5-century journey through war, revolution, and 5 republics. The only company, no doubt, which we might think has discovered the secret of immortality.